The security camera footage would later become evidence in the criminal trial. But, in that moment, as the red recording light blinked steadily overhead, no one was thinking about legal ramifications. The hallway of Mercy General Hospital's pediatric wing echoed with the rhythmic squeak of wheelchair wheels against polished linoleum, punctuated by the sharp click of heels that belonged to Karen Hendricks. Clipboard clutched in her manicured fingers like a weapon of bureaucratic warfare. 8-year-old Zoe Jensen sat hunched in her specialized wheelchair, her hospital gown bunched awkwardly around her thin frame, dark hair falling across her face in tangled strands. The monitors that had been tracking her vital signs just moments before now sat silent in room 314, their screens dark, their alarms disabled. The IV pole that should have been accompanying her stood abandoned beside her empty bed, the clear tubing coiled on the floor like a discarded lifeline. "Ma'am, you cannot do this." Nurse Patricia Williams ran after them, her voice cracking with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. "This child is post-operative. She needs continuous monitoring." Karen's response was delivered without breaking stride, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had spent years wielding power over homeowners associations and hospital volunteer committees. "I am conducting a thorough review of resource allocation, and this family has been flagged for excessive usage. The rules are quite clear regarding visitor protocols and extended stays." The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the scene, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for what would later be described by witnesses as one of the most shocking displays of administrative overreach in the hospital's 70-year history. Zoe's mother, Maria Jensen, stumbled alongside the wheelchair, her face streaked with tears of helpless rage. "Please, you don't understand." Maria's voice broke as she struggled to keep pace. "Zoe has a rare genetic condition. She just had surgery 3 days ago to correct a spinal deformity. Dr. Harrison specifically ordered continuous monitoring because of complications with her breathing." Karen stopped abruptly, the wheelchair jerking to a halt as she pivoted to face Maria with the cold precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "Mrs. Jensen, I've reviewed your file extensively. Your daughter has been occupying a private room for 72 hours, consuming resources that could benefit multiple patients. Furthermore, your family has been bringing outside food, using excessive towels, and your husband has been absent for the entire stay. This suggests a pattern of resource abuse that I cannot, in good conscience, allow to continue." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending pediatric surgeon, emerged from the nearby nurse's station, her scrubs still bearing traces of antiseptic from her morning surgery. She had been watching the confrontation unfold with growing alarm, her professional instincts screaming warnings about the medical dangers of what she was witnessing. "Ms. Hendricks, I need to speak with you immediately." Dr. Chen's voice carried the unmistakable authority of medical training and years of life-or-death decision-making. "This child cannot be moved from her room without medical supervision. She's recovering from a complex spinal fusion, and any disruption to her care protocol could result in serious complications." Karen's response revealed the depth of her conviction in her own authority, a belief system that had been reinforced through years of committee meetings and policy enforcement. She adjusted her glasses, the gesture practiced and deliberate, designed to emphasize her attention to detail and procedural correctness. "Doctor, I appreciate your medical opinion, but I am acting under the authority of the hospital's Resource Management Oversight Committee. I have documentation here." She tapped her clipboard with the tip of her pen, showing that this family has exceeded standard care guidelines by 30%. The child can receive adequate care in a standard room, shared with other patients, which would be a more appropriate use of our facilities. The conversation was drawing attention from throughout the pediatric wing. Other parents emerged from rooms, their faces reflecting the universal fear that comes with seeing another family in crisis within a medical setting. Staff members clustered near the nurse's station, whispering among themselves as they watched the unprecedented scene unfold. Zoe herself had remained silent throughout the confrontation, her small hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair with the white-knuckled determination of a child who had learned, through months of medical procedures and hospital stays, that survival sometimes meant becoming very still and very quiet. But as Karen continued to wheel her farther from her room, farther from the familiar beeping of her monitors and the comfort of her mother's presence, she finally spoke. "I want my daddy." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the echoing hallway, it carried with the weight of absolute vulnerability. "My daddy is coming back today. He promised." Karen's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further, as if the child's plea was simply another manipulation tactic she had encountered countless times in her years of volunteer oversight work. "Your father, young lady, has been absent during your entire stay. That suggests either neglect or an attempt to avoid the financial responsibilities associated with your care. Either way, it's precisely the kind of pattern that requires administrative intervention." Maria Jensen's response was immediate and fierce, the protective instinct of motherhood overriding her earlier shock at the situation. "How dare you? My husband is Dr. Michael Jensen. He's been at a medical conference in Chicago presenting research on pediatric spinal conditions. He's been in contact with the staff every single day, reviewing Zoe's progress and coordinating her care remotely." The mention of Dr. Jensen's name should have given Karen pause. In any other circumstance, in any other hospital, the revelation that a patient's father was a physician would have immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation. But Karen's commitment to her perceived authority had reached a point where contradictory information was processed not as correction, but as deception. "Mrs. Jensen, I've heard every excuse in the book during my years of oversight work. Parents frequently claim professional connections or special circumstances to justify excessive resource usage. The fact remains that your husband is not here. You have been occupying a private room for 3 days, and your daughter's condition, while certainly requiring care, does not justify the level of resources being allocated." Dr. Chen stepped directly into Karen's path, forcing the wheelchair to stop. Her voice carried the calm authority that comes from years of emergency medicine, the kind of unshakable professional composure that emerges in life-threatening situations. "Ms. Hendricks, I am ordering you to return this child to her room immediately. What you're doing right now constitutes medical abandonment, and I will not allow it to continue." Karen's response revealed the full extent of her belief in her own authority within the hospital system. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a laminated card, holding it up like a badge. "Dr. Chen, I am a certified medical facility security liaison, appointed by the hospital board to oversee resource allocation and visitor protocol compliance. I have the authority to make determinations about patient placement and family accommodation. Your medical opinions are noted, but they do not supersede administrative policy." The card was real enough, though its authority was far more limited than Karen believed. Her position as a volunteer coordinator had evolved over the years through a series of committee appointments and policy interpretations that had gradually expanded her perceived scope of authority. She had become, in her own mind, the guardian of hospital resources, the protector of institutional integrity against the endless demands of patients and families who couldn't understand the bigger picture. But Dr. Chen had been practicing medicine for 15 years, and she recognized the signs of administrative overreach when she saw them. More importantly, She understood the medical reality of Zoe's condition in ways that Karen's paperwork could never capture. Ms. Hendricks. This child underwent a 7-hour surgery to correct a congenital spinal deformity. She has titanium rods and screws holding her vertebrae in place while the bone graft heals. Any movement without proper support could displace the hardware, potentially causing paralysis or death. This is not a matter of resource allocation. This is a matter of basic medical safety. The weight of Dr. Chen's words should have penetrated Karen's conviction, but instead, they seemed to strengthen her resolve. She had encountered medical professionals before who tried to use fear tactics to justify excessive resource usage, and she had learned not to be intimidated by technical language or appeals to catastrophic outcomes. Doctor, I understand you feel protective of your patients, but emotional appeals will not change the facts. This family has exceeded standard care protocols. They have shown a pattern of resource abuse, and they must be held accountable. The child will receive appropriate care in a shared room, which is the standard arrangement for patients of her type. The phrase "patients of her type" hung in the air with an ominous weight that wasn't lost on anyone present. Maria Jensen felt the words like a physical blow, the implication clear, even if Karen hadn't explicitly stated what she meant. The assumption that Zoe's disability somehow made her less deserving of quality medical care was a prejudice that the Jensen family had encountered before, but never so blatantly displayed by someone in a position of authority. Nurse Williams had been frantically trying to contact the charge nurse, the floor supervisor, anyone with the authority to intervene in what was rapidly becoming a crisis situation. But it was Wednesday afternoon, and the administrative staff was in their weekly planning meeting, temporarily unreachable just when their intervention was most needed. Ms. Hendricks. Nurse Williams tried one more time, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was surging through her system. I need you to understand that I have been caring for Zoe since her surgery. Her condition is fragile. Her recovery is at a critical stage, and what you're doing right now could set back her healing by weeks or even months. Karen's response revealed the depth of her conviction that medical staff were often too emotionally invested in their patients to make rational decisions about resource allocation. She had seen it countless times during her volunteer work. Nurses and doctors who became so attached to particular cases that they lost sight of the bigger picture. The need to balance individual needs against institutional capacity. Nurse Williams, I appreciate your dedication to your patients, but your emotional investment is precisely why administrative oversight is necessary. You see one child. I see the dozens of other patients who could benefit from the resources being monopolized by this family. It's a matter of perspective, and sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good. As Karen resumed pushing the wheelchair down the hallway, she was unaware that her actions were being recorded by multiple security cameras, each angle capturing different aspects of what would later be analyzed frame by hospital administrators, legal experts, and ultimately, a jury. The footage would show not just the physical actions, but the expressions on faces, the body language that revealed the emotional toll of what was happening. Zoe's condition was beginning to deteriorate in subtle ways that only trained medical personnel would immediately recognize. Her breathing was becoming slightly more labored, her color was shifting toward pale, and her posture in the wheelchair was becoming more rigid. All signs that the stress of the situation was affecting her post-operative recovery. Dr. Chen recognized these signs immediately and made a decision that would later be praised by the hospital board as an example of medical advocacy at its finest. She pulled out her phone and began calling the hospital administration directly, bypassing the normal chain of command in what she determined was a medical emergency. This is Dr. Chen in pediatrics. I need immediate administrative intervention. We have a volunteer coordinator who is endangering a post-operative patient against medical orders. I need security, and the chief of staff in the pediatric wing immediately." But Karen was not deterred by the doctor's actions. In her experience, medical staff often resorted to dramatic gestures when their authority was challenged, and she had learned to stay focused on her administrative responsibilities, regardless of the emotional temperature around her. She guided the wheelchair to the end of the hallway, where a small family waiting area provided a few chairs and a television that was currently playing an afternoon talk show at low volume. The space was designed for short-term waiting, not for medical care, and certainly not for a child recovering from major surgery. "Zoe will wait here while I arrange for her transfer to an appropriate shared room," Karen announced, applying the wheelchair's brake with a decisive click. "Mrs. Jensen, you may sit with her, but I want to make it clear that any attempts to return to the private room will be considered a violation of hospital policy." Maria Jensen sank into one of the waiting room chairs, her energy depleted by the stress of watching her daughter being treated like a bureaucratic problem rather than a vulnerable child. The helplessness was overwhelming, the sense that the system she had trusted with her daughter's life had suddenly turned against them for reasons that made no sense. "Karen, please." Maria's voice was barely above a whisper, the fight temporarily gone out of her as the reality of the situation settled in. "Zoe is 8 years old. She's been through so much already. Can't you see that she needs to be where the doctors can monitor her properly?" Karen's response was delivered with the practiced patience of someone who had dealt with countless emotional parents over the years, all of whom thought their circumstances were unique and deserving of special consideration. "Mrs. Jensen, I understand this is difficult, but rules exist for good reasons. If I made exceptions for every family that requested special treatment, the entire system would collapse. Your daughter will receive appropriate care, just not the excessive level of resources that you've been consuming." The waiting area was not equipped with any medical monitoring equipment, no emergency call buttons, no oxygen outlets, none of the infrastructure that had been specifically designed to support a child recovering from complex spinal surgery. It was a space meant for healthy family members to sit temporarily, not for patient care of any kind. Zoe looked around the unfamiliar space with the confusion of a child whose carefully ordered medical world had suddenly been disrupted. The routine of her hospital room, the familiar sounds of her monitors, the comfort of knowing that nurses were always nearby, had all been stripped away in the span of minutes. "Mommy, when is Daddy coming back?" Zoe's question was asked in the matter-of-fact tone that children use when they're trying to make sense of adult situations that don't follow the rules they understand. Maria checked her phone for the 100th time that day, hoping for an update from her husband's flight status. "Dr. Michael Jensen's conference presentation had gone well, and he was scheduled to land at the regional airport in less than 2 hours. He had been texting updates throughout the day, checking on Zoe's progress and coordinating with the nursing staff about her care protocols. Soon, sweetheart. Daddy's plane should land in a little while, and then he'll come straight here to see you." Karen overheard the conversation and felt compelled to inject a note of realism into what she perceived as false reassurance. "Mrs. Jensen, while your husband may return today, his absence during this critical period has already been noted in the administrative review. Future care decisions will take into account the family's demonstrated level of commitment to the patient's welfare." The implication was clear and devastating. Karen was suggesting that Dr. Jensen's professional obligations, his work to advance pediatric medicine through research and education, somehow indicated neglect of his own daughter. The accusation was so fundamentally unjust that Maria felt a surge of anger that temporarily overcame her exhaustion. "My husband has been working to help children like Zoe for his entire career. The research he presented at this conference could help thousands of kids with spinal conditions. How dare you suggest that his professional dedication means he doesn't care about his own daughter? Karen's response revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the medical profession and the way that physician families navigate the demands of patient care, research, and personal responsibilities. Mrs. Jensen, I've observed many medical families over the years, and I've noticed a pattern where professional obligations are used to justify neglecting family responsibilities. A truly dedicated father would have canceled his conference to be present during his daughter's recovery. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of hospital security, summoned by Dr. Chen's emergency call. Officer James Martinez had been working hospital security for 12 years, and he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. His training had prepared him for medical emergencies, disruptive visitors, and occasionally, psychiatric patients who posed safety risks. But a volunteer coordinator who had apparently gone rogue was outside his experience. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the patient, please." Officer Martinez's voice carried the calm authority of professional security training, designed to de-escalate situations without creating additional confrontation. Karen turned to face the security officer with the confident bearing of someone who believed she was acting within her authority. She produced her volunteer coordinator badge and her medical facility security liaison card, holding them up for inspection. "Officer, I am Karen Hendricks, Certified Medical Facility Security Liaison, acting under the authority of the hospital board to conduct resource allocation reviews. I am currently processing a case of excessive resource usage and implementing appropriate corrective measures." Officer Martinez examined the credentials, noting that, while they appeared legitimate, they certainly didn't authorize the kind of unilateral action that Karen was taking. His radio crackled with an update from the communications center. "Security 1, be advised that Chief of Staff Dr. Rebecca Thompson is en route to your location. She's requesting that you maintain the status quo until her arrival." "Copy that. Dispatch." Officer Martinez looked around the waiting area, taking in the scene, a young girl in a wheelchair and hospital gown. Clearly a patient, a distraught woman who was obviously the child's mother, and a volunteer coordinator who seemed convinced she was acting within her authority despite the obvious medical concerns. "Ms. Hendricks, I'm going to need you to wait here with me until Dr. Thompson arrives. She wants to review the situation before any further action is taken." Karen's reaction revealed her belief that security was being influenced by the same emotional factors that she felt were compromising the medical staff's judgment. "Officer Martinez, I understand that medical personnel can be very persuasive when they want to justify resource abuse. But I have documented evidence of policy violations that require immediate administrative action." She opened her clipboard and began reading from her notes, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone presenting evidence at a formal hearing. "Patient Zoe Jensen, age 8, admitted Monday morning for elective spinal surgery, placed in private room 314, despite standard protocol calling for shared accommodation. Family has occupied room for 72 consecutive hours, consuming resources at a rate 30% above standard allocation guidelines." The recitation continued with increasing detail, each point delivered with the conviction of someone who believed that documentation equals truth, that the accumulation of procedural violations automatically justified the dramatic action she had taken. But Officer Martinez had been listening to the nursing staff as well, and he understood that there might be significant medical factors that weren't captured in Karen's administrative review. Dr. Rebecca Thompson's arrival was announced by the sharp click of her heels against the linoleum floor, a sound that carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent 30 years navigating hospital politics and medical crises. As Chief of Staff, she had dealt with every conceivable administrative challenge. But a volunteer coordinator, who had apparently decided to practice medicine without a license, was a new one. Ms. Hendricks. Dr. Thompson's voice was steady and professional, but underneath the calm exterior was a carefully controlled anger that everyone in the waiting area could sense. I need you to explain to me exactly what you think you're doing. Karen straightened her shoulders and prepared to deliver what she clearly believed would be a compelling justification for her actions. The presence of the chief of staff was actually welcome from her perspective, because it provided an opportunity to present her case to someone with the authority to support her administrative decisions. Dr. Thompson, I am conducting a resource allocation review that has identified significant policy violations requiring immediate corrective action. The Jensen family has been consuming hospital resources at an excessive rate, and I have implemented appropriate measures to bring their usage in line with standard protocols. Dr. Thompson looked around the waiting area, taking in Zoe's condition, Maria's obvious distress, and the security officer's uncertain expression. Then she looked back at Karen with the kind of direct gaze that comes from years of making life or death decisions under pressure. Ms. Hendricks, you have removed a post-operative pediatric patient from her room without medical supervision, disconnected her monitoring equipment, and placed her in a location that is not equipped for patient care. Can you explain to me what medical training qualifies you to make these decisions? Karen's response revealed the extent to which she had conflated administrative authority with medical judgment, a confusion that had been building over years of volunteer work and committee participation. Dr. Thompson, my authority comes from my appointment as a medical facility security liaison and my extensive experience in resource management oversight. Medical opinions are certainly valuable, but they must be balanced against administrative realities and institutional sustainability. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Zoe's labored breathing becoming more pronounced. The stress of the situation, combined with being removed from her post-operative care environment, was beginning to affect her recovery in ways that were becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except Karen. Dr. Thompson immediately knelt beside Zoe's wheelchair, her practiced eye taking in the subtle signs of post-operative distress that were beginning to manifest. Zoe, sweetheart, how are you feeling? Are you having any pain or trouble breathing? Zoe's response was quiet but clear, delivered with the honesty that children bring to medical situations when they're not trying to protect adult feelings. My back hurts more than it did in my room, and it's hard to sit up straight in this chair. Dr. Thompson's examination was brief but thorough, her hands checking Zoe's posture, her breathing pattern, and the alignment of her surgical site. What she found confirmed her worst fears about the potential consequences of Karen's actions. Officer Martinez, I need this child returned to her room immediately. She's showing signs of post-operative complications that require immediate medical attention. Karen stepped forward, her voice rising with the urgency of someone who felt her authority was being undermined by emotional manipulation. Dr. Thompson, you're allowing medical staff to use scare tactics to avoid accountability for resource abuse. This child's condition may require monitoring, but it does not justify the excessive allocation of private room resources. Dr. Thompson stood up slowly, her full attention now focused on Karen, with an intensity that made everyone in the waiting area step back slightly. When she spoke, her voice carried 30 years of medical authority and administrative experience. Ms. Hendricks, you have exceeded your authority, endangered a patient, and interfered with medical care. You are relieved of your volunteer duties effective immediately, and I am calling hospital security to escort you from the premises. But Karen was not prepared to concede defeat, not when she believed so strongly in the righteousness of her cause and the legitimacy of her authority. She had spent years building her reputation as someone who could make the hard decisions that others were too emotionally invested to make. and she was not going to let medical pressure tactics undermine her administrative judgment. Dr. Thompson, I am acting under the direct authority of the hospital board's Resource Management Oversight Committee. You may disagree with my methods, but you do not have the authority to override my administrative decisions without proper board review. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of additional staff members who had been summoned by the various phone calls and radio communications that had been flying around the hospital for the past hour. Nurse Williams arrived with a portable monitor and emergency medication cart. Dr. Chen returned with the pediatric surgery team, and 3 additional security officers appeared at the entrance to the waiting area. But it was the arrival of Dr. Michael Jensen that would ultimately transform the entire situation from an administrative dispute into a personal confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Dr. Jensen had caught an earlier flight when he received concerned text messages from the nursing staff about his daughter's condition. He had spent the taxi ride from the airport reviewing the medical updates on his phone, coordinating with Dr. Chen about Zoe's progress, and preparing himself for the normal routine of post-operative father and physician checking on his daughter's recovery. What he found when he arrived at the pediatric wing was a scene that initially made no sense to him. His daughter, who should have been resting in her carefully monitored room, was instead sitting in a waiting area wheelchair, surrounded by security officers and hospital administration. His wife looked exhausted and upset in a way that suggested something serious had gone wrong during his absence. What the hell is going on here? Doctor. Jensen's voice carried the authority of someone who was accustomed to being in charge of medical situations, but also the concern of a father who was seeing clear signs that his child was in distress. Dr. Thompson turned to face him with obvious relief. Michael, thank God you're here. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. But, before Dr. Thompson could explain further, Karen stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone who believed she was about to present her case to someone who would finally understand the administrative necessity of her actions. She had assumed, based on Maria's earlier statements, that Dr. Jensen was some kind of general practitioner who would be impressed by her credentials and supportive of her resource management oversight. Dr. Jensen, I am Karen Hendricks, Medical Facility Security Liaison. I have been conducting a review of your family's resource usage patterns, and I'm afraid there have been significant policy violations that required immediate administrative intervention. Dr. Jensen looked at Karen with the kind of controlled attention that comes from years of medical training, the ability to gather information quickly while suppressing emotional responses until all the facts are clear. Ms. Hendricks, can you explain to me why my daughter is not in her room receiving post-operative care? Karen interpreted his calm tone as professional understanding and began her prepared presentation with renewed confidence. Dr. Jensen, your family has been occupying a private room for 72 hours, which exceeds standard protocol by 30%. Additionally, your absence during this critical period suggested either neglect or an attempt to avoid financial responsibility. I determined that immediate corrective action was necessary to prevent further resource abuse. The words hung in the air for a moment while Dr. Jensen processed what he was hearing. Then he turned to look at his daughter, taking in her labored breathing, her uncomfortable posture, and the obvious signs that she was not receiving the level of post-operative care that her condition required. When he looked back at Karen, his expression had changed completely. The controlled professional demeanor was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who had just realized that his child had been endangered by administrative incompetence. Ms. Hendricks, I am Dr. Michael Jensen, Medical Director of this hospital. I have been at a medical conference presenting research on pediatric spinal conditions. Research that was specifically designed to improve outcomes for children exactly like my daughter. I have been in constant contact with the medical staff throughout Zoe's stay, and I personally approved every aspect of her care protocol. The revelation hit Karen like a physical blow. In all her years of volunteer oversight work, she had never encountered a situation where she had so fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamics of the people she was dealing with. The confident certainty that had carried her through the confrontation began to crumble as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Dr. Jensen continued, his voice gaining volume and authority with each word. You have removed my daughter from her post-operative care environment, disconnected her monitoring equipment, and placed her in a location that is completely inappropriate for someone recovering from complex spinal surgery. You have endangered her health and potentially compromised her recovery for reasons that are not just medically unjustified, but administratively fraudulent. Karen tried to respond, but her usual confident delivery was gone, replaced by a stammering attempt to salvage some semblance of authority from the rapidly collapsing situation. Dr. Jensen, I was acting under proper administrative protocol. I have documentation showing resource usage violations. Ms. Hendricks. Dr. Jensen's voice cut through her attempted explanation with surgical precision. You have no medical authority, no clinical training, and no understanding of the complex care requirements that my daughter's condition demands. What you have done is not administration, it's endangerment, and it ends right now. He turned to the security officers with the kind of direct command presence that comes from years of running medical teams in crisis situations. Officers, I want this woman removed from the pediatric wing immediately. She is not to have any further contact with patients or their families. But Karen was not prepared to accept defeat, even in the face of the overwhelming authority arrayed against her. The identity she had built around being the person who made hard decisions, who protected institutional resources against emotional manipulation, was too central to her sense of self to be abandoned easily. Dr. Jensen, your personal involvement in this case creates a clear conflict of interest. The resource allocation review process exists precisely to prevent the kind of preferential treatment that medical staff families often receive. I was acting to ensure institutional fairness and procedural integrity. Dr. Jensen's response was delivered with the kind of cold fury that comes from a lifetime of dealing with bureaucratic incompetence that endangers patient safety. Ms. Hendricks, you are going to return my daughter to her room immediately. You are going to reconnect her monitoring equipment. And then, you are going to explain to hospital administration exactly what authority you believed gave you the right to practice medicine without a license. The confrontation was now drawing attention from throughout the hospital. Word had spread through the nursing staff, the medical teams, and the administrative offices that something unprecedented was happening in the pediatric wing. Staff members were arriving from other departments, drawn by curiosity and concern about the commotion. Among them was Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief medical officer, who had been summoned by multiple phone calls reporting that the medical director was involved in some kind of emergency situation involving his daughter. She arrived to find a crowd of staff members, security officers, and family members clustered around the pediatric waiting area in a scene that looked more like a legal proceeding than a medical consultation. Michael, what's happening here? Dr. Williams' voice carried the concern of a colleague and the authority of someone who expected immediate and complete information. Dr. Jensen turned to face her, and she could see in his expression the controlled rage of a father whose child had been threatened, and a physician whose professional judgment had been overruled by administrative incompetence. Patricia, this woman, he gestured toward Karen, has removed Zoe from her post-operative care environment based on some kind of resource allocation review that she apparently conducted without any medical input or administrative authorization. Dr. Williams looked around the scene, taking in Zoe's obvious discomfort, Maria's distressed condition, and Karen's defensive posture. As chief medical officer, she had dealt with administrative overreach before, but never at this level, and never involving a post-operative pediatric patient. Ms. Hendricks, I need you to explain to me exactly what authority you believe gives you the right to make medical decisions about patient care. Karen's response revealed the extent to which she had convinced herself that her volunteer oversight role carried actual medical authority. She produced her clipboard and began reading from her documentation with the same confident delivery she had used throughout the confrontation. Dr. Williams, I am acting under the authority of my appointment as Medical Facility Security Liaison, with specific responsibility for resource allocation, oversight, and protocol compliance. The Jensen family's resource usage pattern indicated clear policy violations requiring immediate corrective action. Dr. Williams listened to the recitation with the kind of professional attention that comes from years of evaluating complex medical and administrative situations. When Karen finished, Dr. Williams's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone who understood both the medical and legal implications of what had occurred. Ms. Hendricks, you have no medical training, no clinical authority, and no legal right to make decisions about patient care. What you have done constitutes practicing medicine without a license, which is a criminal offense. You have also endangered a child's health and safety, which compounds the legal liability you've created for yourself and for this institution. The weight of Dr. Williams's words began to penetrate Karen's certainty for the first time since the confrontation began. The legal implications she had not considered, the possibility that her administrative oversight role might not provide the protection she had assumed, started to create doubt where there had been absolute conviction. But even as doubt crept in, Karen's commitment to her perceived role as protector of institutional resources drove her to make one final attempt to justify her actions. Dr. Williams, if medical families are allowed to circumvent standard resource allocation protocols, the entire system becomes vulnerable to abuse. Someone has to make the difficult decisions that medical staff are too emotionally invested to make objectively. Dr. Williams' response was swift and final. Ms. Hendricks, your volunteer services are terminated immediately. You will have no further contact with patients, families, or medical staff. Security will escort you from the premises. And you can expect to hear from our legal department about the consequences of your actions today. As security officers stepped forward to escort Karen from the pediatric wing, she made one last appeal to Dr. Jensen, apparently still believing that physician-to-administrator communication might salvage something from the situation. Dr. Jensen, I hope you understand that I was acting in what I believed were the hospital's best interests. Resource management is essential for institutional sustainability. Dr. Jensen's response was delivered with the kind of finality that comes from someone who has seen enough medical crises to understand the difference between legitimate administrative concern and dangerous overreach. Ms. Hendricks, what you did today had nothing to do with resource management and everything to do with power abuse. You endangered my daughter's health to satisfy your own need for authority, and that is something I will neither forget nor forgive. As Karen was escorted away by security, her confident bearing finally began to crumble. The reality of her situation, the magnitude of her miscalculation, and the potential consequences of her actions were beginning to penetrate the certainty that had carried her through the confrontation. But even as she was led away, she continued to mutter about policy violations and resource abuse. Her identity so tied to her perceived administrative authority that she couldn't fully accept its collapse. With Karen gone, The focus immediately shifted back to Zoe's medical needs. Dr. Jensen and the nursing staff worked quickly to return her to room 314, reconnect her monitoring equipment, and assess any damage that might have been caused by the disruption to her post-operative care. The monitors came back online with their familiar beeping. The IV was reattached, and the familiar routine of post-surgical care was restored. But the trauma of the experience had taken its toll on Zoe, both physically and emotionally, and it would take time to fully assess the impact of Karen's intervention on her recovery. As the medical team worked to stabilize Zoe's condition, Dr. Jensen found himself dealing with the administrative aftermath of the incident. Phone calls had to be made, reports had to be filed, and the legal implications of what had occurred needed to be addressed both for the hospital's protection and to ensure that Karen faced appropriate consequences for her actions. The investigation that followed would reveal the extent to which Karen's volunteer oversight role had gradually expanded beyond its original scope through a series of administrative oversights and procedural ambiguities. Her appointment as medical facility security liaison had been largely ceremonial, designed to give volunteers a sense of official responsibility while maintaining clear boundaries around actual decision-making authority. But over the years, Karen had interpreted her role more and more broadly, taking on responsibilities that were never intended and making decisions that were well beyond her authority. The hospital's administrative structure had failed to provide adequate oversight of her activities, creating the conditions that allowed her to believe she had the power to override medical decisions. The legal consequences for Karen were severe and immediate. She was charged with practicing medicine without a license, child endangerment, and interference with medical care. Her medical facility security license was permanently revoked, and civil lawsuits were filed by the Jensen family and the hospital seeking damages for the trauma and potential medical complications caused by her actions. The trial that followed became a landmark case in medical facility administration and volunteer oversight. The security camera footage of Karen wheeling Zoe into the hallway, the testimony of medical staff about the dangers of her actions, and the documentation of her gradual expansion of authority beyond any reasonable bounds created a compelling case study in administrative overreach and its consequences. Karen's defense team attempted to argue that she had been acting in good faith based on her understanding of her role and responsibilities. But the evidence was overwhelming that she had exceeded any reasonable interpretation of her authority and had endangered a child's health in the process. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for the Jensen family to speak about the impact of Karen's actions on their daughter's recovery and their trust in the medical system. Dr. Jensen's victim impact statement was particularly powerful, describing not just the immediate medical dangers, but the long-term psychological effects on a child who had been made to feel that her medical needs were somehow illegitimate or excessive. Your Honor, Dr. Jensen addressed the court. What happened to my daughter represents a fundamental violation of the trust that patients and families place in medical institutions. When someone in a position of perceived authority tells a sick child that she doesn't deserve the care she's receiving, the damage goes far beyond any immediate medical complications. It strikes at the heart of the healing relationship that is essential to medical care. Karen was sentenced to 2 years in prison, 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay substantial restitution to cover Zoe's additional medical expenses and counseling costs. The judge's remarks during sentencing emphasized the seriousness of endangering a vulnerable child and the need to send a clear message about the boundaries of volunteer authority in medical settings. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the incident was the comprehensive reform of hospital volunteer programs that followed. Mercy General Hospital, along with medical facilities throughout the region, implemented new training programs, clearer authority boundaries, and more robust oversight mechanisms to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The Zoe Jensen Compassion and Care Initiative became a model program that was adopted by hospitals nationwide. It emphasized not just the importance of appropriate medical care, but the need for all staff members, volunteers, and administrators to understand that every patient deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their condition, their family's circumstances, or their resource requirements. For the Jensen family, the healing process extended far beyond Zoe's physical recovery from her surgery. The trauma of seeing their daughter treated as an administrative problem rather than a vulnerable child required months of family counseling and careful rebuilding of trust in medical institutions. But they chose to channel their experience into advocacy work, speaking at medical conferences and administrative training sessions about the patient perspective on hospital policies and procedures. Zoe's recovery from the spinal surgery was ultimately successful, though the disruption caused by Karen's intervention did set back her healing process by several weeks. More importantly, the emotional support provided by the hospital staff, the validation of her worth as a patient, and the clear message that what happened to her was wrong helped her maintain her trust in the medical system that she would need to rely on for the rest of her life. Dr. Jensen used his position as medical director to implement systemic changes that would prevent future incidents of administrative overreach. New protocols were established for volunteer oversight. Clear boundaries were drawn around decision-making authority, and regular training programs were instituted to ensure that all staff members understood both their responsibilities and their limitations. The case also sparked broader conversations in the medical community about the balance between administrative efficiency and patient care, the importance of protecting vulnerable patients from bureaucratic abuse, and the need for institutional cultures that prioritize compassionate care over procedural compliance. Years later, as Zoe grew up and her spinal condition continued to improve, the family would look back on the incident not just as a traumatic experience, but as a turning point that led to meaningful reforms in medical care administration. The security camera footage that had captured Karen's actions became a powerful teaching tool, used in medical schools and hospital training programs to illustrate the importance of patient advocacy and the dangers of unchecked administrative authority. Karen herself, after serving her prison sentence, attempted to rebuild her life, but found that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond the legal penalties. Her story became a cautionary tale in volunteer training programs, and her name became synonymous with the dangers of administrative overreach in medical settings. She eventually moved to another state and avoided any involvement in healthcare or volunteer work, the cost of her moment of absolute certainty in her own authority having proved to be the destruction of the identity she had built around helping others. The pediatric wing of Mercy General Hospital remained a place of healing and hope, but it also became a symbol of the importance of protecting vulnerable patients from those who might abuse positions of authority. The waiting area where Zoe had been forced to sit in her wheelchair was renovated and dedicated as a family comfort space, with a small plaque that read simply, "In honor of all patients who deserve compassionate care." And in room 314, where Zoe had recovered from her surgery, and where other children would continue to receive the complex medical care they needed, the monitors continued their steady beeping. The nurses continued their vigilant care. And the message was clear: every child deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and the full resources of modern medicine, regardless of what any administrator might think about resource allocation or protocol compliance. The story of Karen Hendricks and Zoe Jensen became more than just a tale of administrative overreach and its consequences. It became a reminder that in medical settings, the needs of vulnerable patients must always take precedence over bureaucratic concerns, and that those entrusted with any level of authority must never forget that their primary responsibility is to protect and serve those who depend on them for care and healing.